Chapter 2 of A Diamond in the Rough by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, in which Moses Wyse gets the worst of it. Fred King was one of nature's young noblemen, a diamond in the rough. He was 16 years of age, strong, healthy, and every inch the man, from the crown of his curly brown head to the soles of his well-worn shoes. All he needed was the polish afforded by education and contact with good society. At the early age of 10, the sudden death of his father in the mines forced him to go to work as a slate picker in the dense, dusty atmosphere of the Black Diamond Breaker, where for many months he spent long hours daily astride a narrow chute, sorting the slate from the coal, as both descended in continuous streams from the massive screens through which they had been sifted in fragments. His companions, then, had been boys of his own age, many of whom were prematurely stunted and evidently broken in health by the life they were compelled to lead. But Fred survived this terrible period in his young career, though he narrowly escaped the awful fate which had befallen more than one of the weaker boys, of being swept from the chute into the pockets, receptacles into which the coal, when freed from all impurities, ran prior to being loaded into the railroad cars for transportation to the market. King was such a good-natured, sunny-faced lad that he became a general favorite, not only in the Black Diamond colliery, but throughout the little mining village as well. And when his mother died, leaving him an orphan, he did not care to leave the place. After a time, the engineer who had taken a great fancy to him managed to have him assigned to the furnace room as a sort of general helper. Here he was employed to do the lowest and dirtiest work in the place, to wheel the refuse to the cinder heap, and to scrape the clinkers in the scale from inside the boilers on Sundays and such other days when the engines were shut down. Recently he had been promoted to the engine room, where he oiled the cups, cleaned the brass and other parts of the machinery, and attended to such other duties as the job called for. John Marsh, the engineer, began to instruct him in all the mysteries of the big engine which ran the machinery of the colliery. He proposed to make the boy an able assistant and evidently a first-class engineer like himself. It was an exceptional opportunity which was presented to Fred to forge his way into the front in a splendid calling. Fred King had become acquainted with Andy Marsh when he first went to the boiler room, and that acquaintance had steadily ripened, with John Marsh's approval, until the young people got upon a very cordial footing. The boy was always welcomed at the Marsh cottage, for he was a modest fellow and never presumed upon the standing he had attained. "I would give a great deal to have a son like him," Mr. Marsh more than once said to his wife, and the good woman was in full sympathy with his feeling. Moses Wyse, who persistently tried to force his undesirable attentions on Annie, was, on the contrary, not looked upon with favor by the girl's parents, nor, as we have seen, by Miss Marsh herself. Therefore Moses hated Fred, and had registered a vow to do him up at the first opportunity, not fairly and above board, but on the quiet if he could, for Moses had a wholesome respect for Fred's prowess. As we have said, the two boys stood face to face that evening on the dusty banks of the Susquehanna, Moses Wyse still holding Annie Marsh by the wrists. "You'll make me, will you?" snarled Moses, whose anger had made him uncommonly bold. Fred didn't waste another word upon him, but grabbing his wrists with a grip of steel made him release the girl. "I'll kill you!" yelled the young villain, making a furious lunge at Fred, which the boy easily avoided by stepping quickly to one side. "I don't think you will," answered King coolly. I will if I die for it," screamed Moses, livid with passion. "I wouldn't get so excited if I were you," said the other placidly. Moses sprang at him furiously and tried to strike him in the face. Fred warded off the blow, but made no attempt to retaliate. His passiveness encouraged the loutish boy to further effort. He brought his strength into full play, and Fred woke up to the fact that matters were altogether too far to be pleasant. "You will have it, eh?" Smash! Moses got a straight one in the eye. For the next minute it was nip and tuck between them, Fred catching a staggering thump on the chest from his enemy's big fist. Then biff! Wyse caught it under the chin, and his head went back with a jerk. "Have you had enough?" asked Fred, as Moses put his hands to his jaw and hung back. The little villain made no reply, his bulging eyes fairly snapping with fury. Then he suddenly rushed a yard away, stooped down and picked up a big chunk of slate and let it drive full at Fred's head. Only the quickest kind of duck saved the boy from what must have proved a fatal blow. As it was, one of the sharp corners of the missile tore a jagged wound along the side of his head, from which the blood started freely. Annie, who had been watching the conflict with anxious eyes, uttered a suppressed scream and ran to Fred. The cowardly act, however, so angered King that he rushed upon Moses with compressed lips that told how fully aroused he was. It was thump, bish, smash, thump for the next minute, and when he let up, young Wyse was reduced to a cowering wreck and fairly begged for quarter. "Get out of here!" cried Fred, unmistakably in earnest. "The next time you run up against me that way, you'll have to be shoveled into a cart and carried home. Go, do you hear?" Moses heard, understood, and slunk away like the cur he was. But his black little heart was full of hate and an unquenchable desire to get square with the boy who had so thoroughly humiliated him in the presence of Annie Marsh. "When I went to the door of the engine room to get a basin of water to wash up, I heard you scream," said Fred in explanation of his presence on the scene, as he took one of the girl's hands to look at her wrist, chafed by Moses Wyse's rough grasp. "I'm so glad you came," she said earnestly. "But, oh, so sorry you have been hurt on my behalf. You are bleeding dreadfully," she added anxiously. "Can't I do something to stop the blood?" "It doesn't amount to anything," he answered carelessly. "I will go with you to the engine house and bathe and bind it up for you," she said eagerly. "Well," he replied, pleased with the concern she showed, "come along." They walked hand in hand to the engine room like a couple of children, and then he got a basin of warm water and a bar of yellow soap. He washed the blood out of his hair and from his wound roughly, and after that removed the grime and oil from his face and dried it with a coarse towel. After that he submitted to the gentle ministrations of Annie, who thoroughly cleansed the wound and bound it up with his handkerchief. "There, you look much better now, Fred," she said, smiling into his face. "Thanks, Annie. That's as good as a doctor could have done. You'd better go to the druggist and have it properly attended to." "I will if you go along," he bargained with a cheerful grin. "Why, of course I will, if you wish me to." "It's a bargain. Wait till I pull off my working suit and we'll start." Annie's father had gone home half an hour before, and but for the trouble, Fred himself would have been at his lodgings eating supper by this time. "Mother will certainly be wondering what has become of me," she said as they started off into the village. "Then I guess I better not keep you," said Fred regretfully. "A few minutes more won't make any difference," she replied lightly. "How did you come across Moses?" he asked curiously. "I caught him beating little Eddie Foster, and it made me so angry that I interfered and made him let the boy go." "Good for you," grinned Fred admiringly. "Then he wanted to walk home with me," she went on, tossing her head disdainfully. "Just as if I would permit him to do so." "You don't like him?" "No, I don't. Haven't I told you so before?" "Well, I guess you have, and I don't blame you." "He's a disagreeable, mean-spirited boy," she said outspokenly. "The idea of him grabbing me by the two wrists and wanting to make me do as he wished. What do you suppose he threatened to do?" she asked indignantly. "What?" "Why, throw me into the river." "You don't mean it!" exclaimed Fred, somewhat astonished. "He said he had a good mind to do that, and he spoke earnestly enough to frighten me. When he pushed me back, as if he really intended to carry out his threat, I screamed." "He's getting to be as bad as his father," said Fred. "I was up in the screen room the other day, and the way Jake Wyse was beating the little kids would have made your blood boil. It was bad enough in my time, but it's worse under Jake. He acts like a raving demon with those little slate pickers." "Poor little fellows. They've had a hard time of it," she said with a shudder. When they entered the drugstore, the druggist fixed Fred up in good shape. A few minutes later the boy bade Annie good night at the entrance to the lane, a stone's throw from her home, and continued on to his own lodgings. End of chapter 2.